The Euporia has received an incredible buff as of patch 1.13 to where the luster effect is much easier to get to, the buff of the luster effect is better, and the duration has also been increased. So before the patch, it required 6 light attacks or 2 charged heavy attacks to gain the first buff, and it had to be done in quick succession, and this buff did last 20 seconds. And if you did want to reach the second buff, you had to repeat the process, 6 light attacks, 2 charged heavies, and then it would add an additional 20 seconds to the timer. But as of the current patch, it is a lot easier to reach the luster effect. It only requires 3 light attacks or 1 charged heavy to reach the first buff, which has now been improved to give you plus 100 holy damage from the plus 30 that it used to give. And this buff now actually does last 30 seconds. But upon reaching this luster effect, your skill does actually get turned into a projectile attack. And this projectile attack does do roughly the same amount of damage as like the regular skill when it actually is uncharged, but it is just going to do it at a further distance, and it actually is going to do 20 stance damage. And to reach the second buff, you basically repeat the process, 3 light attacks or 1 charged heavy attack. And then upon reaching the second buff, you actually do get plus 50 to holy damage, which is the same from pre-patch, and actually does add an additional 30 seconds onto it. Now, when using this skill, when it actually is buffed the second time, it still is going to turn it into a projectile attack, but it is just going to last like 3 times longer, which obviously means there's a lot more damage. And it actually can do 60 stance damage at a distance, and when using it at point blank range, it can do roughly 90 stance damage, which is just insane. And you actually can turn and aim it as well, so you're not really just locked into one position like you are with Comet Azure. But the major downside of this skill is obviously it's a longer animation, and you don't get any hyper armor, so you can get staggered out of it very easily. Now, how the timer works is actually a little complicated, but I will try my best to explain it. But basically, there are 2 different thresholds. There is the 30-second threshold and a 60-second threshold, which obviously is indicative of the first and second buff. And as for the formula, your light attacks are worth roughly 13 seconds, and your charged heavy attack is worth roughly like 33 seconds. So basically, if you hit with a charged heavy attack, it is going to meet the minimum threshold of the first buff. You do it again within those 3 seconds, and then it's going to reach the threshold of the second buff. Or alternatively, if you do use 3 light attacks, it is going to meet the minimum threshold of the first buff, and then it starts the timer at roughly 30 seconds. And as for another example, let's just say you hit with 2 light attacks, it is going to result in you getting to 26 seconds. And say you waited like about 15 seconds, you're going to be back at 11 seconds, so you actually need to hit with another 2 light attacks just to reach the first threshold again. And once you actually do reach the second buff, you can actually keep adding onto the timer as much as you want. So if you spam like 5 charged heavy attacks in a row, you'll actually gain the second buff, and it will actually last over 2 minutes. There is a bit more as to how the timer does decay, but I'm not going to really break it down that thoroughly. This is going to be like a rough understanding as to how it does work. Now, I have been getting a lot of questions asking if this is actually good power stance, and for me personally, I don't think it's optimal, but it is still really good. Now, the reason why I don't consider it optimal is because the power stancing combos take a lot longer to actually build up the stacks, and I mean like a lot longer. It'll take up to like 10 light attacks to actually proc the buff, and if you're doing jumping attacks, it's going to be even longer than that. Now, if you did have 2 Euporias, it actually is going to be a bit quicker, but it's still not going to be that fast. It still takes a lot longer. I did like 6 jumping power sense attacks with the Euporias, and it just did the first buff, which is obviously not going to be that optimal. But the good thing about the Euporia when having 2 of them is that when you have one buffed, it actually adds the buff onto the other one, and that doesn't even need to be equipped. You can just get the buff of the first one and then switch to it later on, and it's just going to keep the buff. And this is actually the highest damaging Twin Blade in the game when both buffs are active, so it actually can make for one of the best jumping attack builds in the game. But there are going to be 2 downsides. One, when you actually do use the skill, it actually removes the buff for both weapons. And as I mentioned, it does take a while to actually gain the stacks with power stance. So you can actually just go use their 2-handed attacks and just do like a couple of charged heavies, and then you actually will gain the second buff, and you can go ahead and power stance that way. But in the time to where it took to actually charge up the weapon 2 times, you probably could have just used like a regular Twin Blade jumping attack build and just did more damage in that instance, of which the Black Steel Twin Blade is going to be the better option. This weapon with Sacred Blade is actually going to do more damage than the Euporia, unless the Euporia does actually have both of its buffs. And actually is going to be easier to set up as well, but you only can get 1 per playthrough, so actually having the Euporia in the offhand could be a decent power stancing option. But I think the optimal path for the Euporia is just going into a 2-handed, because that's going to help build up the stacks a lot faster, and actually does help maximize using the skill a lot more as well, which is what today's build is going to be about, utilizing all of the light attacks and charged heavy attacks. Now, for this build, being that the Euporia does get a much better faith than a strength and dexterity scaling, which is going to meet the minimum requirements of strength and dexterity at 16 and put the rest of the points into faith. Now, if you do have a much higher leveled build, and you have about 80 faith already, I recommend is putting the rest of the points into strength and dexterity. But Twin Blades themselves have amazing synergy with the multi-hit items, of which we are going to be using all of them. The Millicent Prosthesis, Rotten Wing Sword Insignia, and the Thorny Cracked tier. These things all stack with one another and does help you output so much damage. Now, if you don't have the Rotten Wing Sword Insignia, just using the regular Sword Insignia is going to work perfectly fine. Now, I'm actually not going to use things like the Axe Talisman and the Spiked Cracked tier, despite actually using a bunch of charged heavy attacks. But the multi-hit items actually give me more of a damage boost, and with how many times you can hit in quick succession with the light attacks, and especially those charged heavy attacks, it's just going to be a better option. Now, those charged heavy attacks, I typically don't like them that much, because there are longer animations, and they do just as much stance damage as a straight sword, which is kind of annoying. But the synergy with the multi-hit talismans definitely makes up for it. We're also going to have the two-handed sword talisman, which is just 15% more damage just by having the weapon two-handed. Now, that's just going to be for our light attacks and heavy attacks. It is not going to include critical damage or weapon skill damage, but we are going to have the Shard of Alexander for 15% more skill damage, the Holy Tier for 15% more damage for 3 minutes, and we are going to have the Sword of Light in our back pocket. The skill of this weapon does give you 20% more holy damage for 60 seconds, and it is going to be a body buff, so it can stack with Golden Vow. You can just use both of these things before a boss fight, and this is going to result in much more damage. But being that we do have a faith build, we might as well utilize some spells with the Erdtree seal, because this is the best seal to use at 69 faith and above. Now, our weapon is actually going to do a projectile attack anyway, so this is going to be our primary option. So you only really want to use your spells for coverage and damage types, just in case you go up against those enemies that are really resist to holy damage, of which I have Catch Flame as the best fire-based option. Knight Lightning Spear is like the best single target option, and it's a really good lightning option as well. And Pest Thread Spears as a good physical option, and against those larger bosses, it's just going to destroy them. And you can go with a healing type of spell. I'll go with Heal from Afar, but something like Erdtree Heal is amazing as well. And I do have the entire Rakshasa armor set on. Every single piece is going to add an additional 2%. If you do see yourself using a bunch of like running attacks, then you could wear Ladder's armor. Although the armor set is just completely optional, you can just go any which way that you want to. It is not that necessary to have these things. But yeah, the entire gameplay loop is just spamming charged heavy attacks when you have like a slightly longer opening, or just using the light attacks. And in any instance where an enemy gets further away from you, you can just use the skill. Whether it's fully charged or not, you're just going to benefit, because it doesn't really matter. You can build up the stacks of damage so quickly that you can just benefit of just spamming the skill at any point. But even if you don't have a longer opening to use the skill, it's still perfectly fine, because worst case scenario, you have the highest damaging Twin Blade in the game. When that thing is fully maxed out, you're doing so much damage, and you have all these multi-hit talismans, you're still going to be melting so many bosses in this game. And being that this buff does actually last a long time, you can actually go ahead throughout legacy dungeons and kill a bunch of enemies, make the buff last like 2 minutes, and you can just go ahead and run to a boss, and you will have the buff fully charged, and you can just like lead off the boss fight with this skill, and you can just do like a good chunk of a boss's health right at the beginning of the fight. But as for my overall thoughts of the weapon and actually where I would rank it on a list, I don't think it's top 10, potentially top 25 weapon. It is definitely a comfortable S tier, because it can output high amounts of damage, and the skill can hit at further distances. Although when the skill is fully charged, it still has a longer animation that you can't cancel, that you get no hyper armor in. And against those more mobile enemies that like to move around a whole bunch, it's not going to perform that well. And it still is a Twin Blade, therefore their stance damage is not that good. And you do get stuck in longer animations, specifically with those heavy attacks. And the fact that it is doing holy damage means that it's not going to be as good in the base game. But there are so many positives to this weapon now. But I am really glad to say that it is an S tier weapon, and the best Twin Blade in the game too. Anyway, that is the video now done and complete. As always, let me know what your opinions are down in the comments below. The next video, I'm probably going to touch on like the best changes of the recent patch, for like the top 10 best things that actually were to come out of patch 1.13. I do also want to touch on some of the things that did get nerfed, like the Claws of Night and the Impenetrable Thorn spell. So if you do want to see those, definitely do subscribe or follow me on Twitch, because that's where I do all of my testing and stuff. But yeah, catch you guys around. Bye.